Hey, welcome everybody to our webinar, the Tamarack webinar on the power of place. We're really happy that you're joining us today. We've got a real mix of folks who've registered for the webinar today. We've got folks from the UK, we've got folks from Canada and the United States, Australia, New Zealand. It's really a global group that we're gathering together. So we'll get underway. My name's Liz Weaver, and I'm the co-CEO of Tamarack, of the Tamarack Institute. And it's really my pleasure to be joined today by Emily, Joe, and John. And we'll hear a little bit more about each of them in a minute. This webinar is called The Power of Place, and we're going to learn about the research that they've been doing in the UK about the importance of place and placemaking. And so I'm sure that you'll find it a very interesting webinar. I want to begin this webinar, though, by acknowledging the land on which we're meeting. And so, you know, Canada is going through a truth and reconciliation process, and there are 94 calls to action that those of us who live in Canada need to pay attention to. And this is really focused on our relationship with Indigenous peoples in Canada. And so we want to begin this workshop by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous land, and that as settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet. And we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of the land. And I wanted to pause here and just read one of the principles from the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action document, which informs us at Tamarack of the work and the importance of our relationship as an organization with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous nations. Reconciliation requires sustained public education and dialogue, including youth engagement, about the history and legacy of residential schools, treaties, Aboriginal rights, as well as the historical and contemporary contributions of Aboriginal peoples to Canadian society. I wanted to read that principle, particularly because it's relevant to the tragic news that we all heard about the 215 children that were found at the Kamloops residential school. And at Tamarack, we stand in grief with our Indigenous colleagues and neighbors. This is traumatic history, and you know, as part of our need to move forward, we have to acknowledge this history and really lean into the truth and reconciliation process. So thank you for that. Those of you that are joining us from Indigenous lands, please do use the chat function to let us know where you're joining us from. Hey, I'm really excited to be joined by my colleagues from the UK, Emily Sun, Joe Blundell, and John Hitchin. I keep on pronouncing your name slightly wrong, John. I had the great good fortune of meeting Emily and Joe about a year ago now when I was in the UK for a course, and they were, you know, talking about the power of place and the work that they were looking to lead in the UK. And so we're going to hear more about that today. But I wanted to start by just introducing you to our guests on this call. So Emily Sun. Emily consults to organizations in the health, education, and social sectors that are interested in building cultures and teams where collaboration, learning, and innovation can flourish. She's particularly interested in organizations that are focused on community-based, multi-stakeholder approaches that accomplish complex systemic issues and opportunities, that address complex systemic issues and opportunities. Emily has been with Project Place in the UK since 2019, and it's a collaboration which is focused on building a center of learning for place-based work across the UK. Now I'm going to introduce you to Joe. Joe has a background in the UK public service sector and has deep interest in designing and delivering transformation through collaboration and through engagement with people with lived experience and citizens. There's a nice connection between Jo's work and Tamarak's work. She's a service designer and works as part of a network of people and organizations, including Collaborate CIC, the Design Council, Government Outcomes Lab, and Project Place. She is a fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University and co-authored Are We Rallying Together? Collaboration and Public Sector Reform with colleagues from the Government Outcomes Lab. So John is the chief executive of the social enterprise Renaissy, which has been delivering place-based approaches in the UK and working with others to think about place since its founding in 1998. So Renaissy is just slightly older than Tamarak, than the Tamarak Institute. We were founded just slightly after that. Renaissy delivers frontline support to economically excluded adults in London, works as a research, evaluation, and strategy consultancy for social sector organizations, and coordinates place-based systemic work. John works with partners and clients on questions of leadership, collaboration, place, impact, and systems change. This currently includes a network of social action place programs, an anchor collaborative in Hackney, a social investment partnership in Southwark, I probably pronounced that wrong, and an innovative partnership with 6 major foundations through Local Motion. So we're going to hear a little bit more about the really interesting work that Renaissy is engaged in during the course of the webinar as well. So that gives you a little bit of background about Emily, Jo, and John. So excited to have you, the 3 of you, join us and to learn more, not only about the research that you all have been engaged in, but also to learn a little bit more about Renaissy as well. So welcome. I'm going to start with a series of questions. And so this question is for each of you to answer. So maybe we'll start with you, Emily. But can you just give us some highlights of the research that you've been doing in the UK, particularly around place-based change?
Thank you, Liz. And it's so wonderful to be here. So thank you for that opportunity. Yes, so Project Place has partnered with Renaissy and John's team to look at about 18 or so place-based change initiatives across the UK. And we kind of defined place-based work as collaborative, multi-sector working who are trying to achieve a set of agreed outcomes together in a defined place, and hopefully outcomes that are sustained through some level of systems change as well. So very similar to kind of concepts of collective impact. And the 2 questions we wanted to ask and research were, 1, what are the key challenges and enablers of place-based work today across the UK? And secondly, what is the role that learning can play in place-based work? And there were so many highlights, but today maybe I'll focus just on 3 that perhaps came through to us as particularly interesting. One was around the topic of power, and it's not surprising to anyone with experience in this work that one of the most fundamental challenges to place-based work is to shift traditional power dynamics towards communities and people who haven't had enough of it in the past. But what we found through this research is that that's not enough, that in addition to doing that, places also need to influence and plug into existing sources of power so that they can access funding, change policy, and so that they can ensure that the changes are sustained over the long run as well. So the ability to manage this tension is not easy, but it's absolutely necessary. And sometimes it takes contradictory approaches as well. So that was one theme. The other thing that came through that was really interesting was this idea about the identity of place-based work and place-based change makers. So even though there's been quite a long tradition of place-based work in the UK, what we found was that the sort of identity or the vocation of place-based work has not really been defined or articulated here as well, as I think it could be. And there was a real sort of demand and desire for it to be sort of defined more when we talk to people engaged in this work across the 18 places that we talk to. And there was kind of this desire for a common set of frameworks, common language, a common identity that not only just sort of gives legitimacy and validity to the work, but it also makes it much easier for everyone else to understand quickly what place-based work is about and what that vocation is. And I kind of compare it to the identity of an entrepreneur. You know, there's so many different ways that an entrepreneur carries out their work. But, you know, when people hear that term, we kind of immediately think of a certain mindset and attitude and approach to doing things. And for the most part, quite positive. So it would be amazing to be able to define that better for place-based work because it's such essential stuff. The third key theme, and this is my last one, is really about the sort of criticality of the role of learning. And what we found was this kind of big disconnect between, on the one hand, everyone acknowledging that learning is essential to being able to do their work and to improve what they do. But pretty much the vast majority of people are also saying that they really struggle to find time and resources to do learning in a systematic way. And that was quite a sort of large and common disconnect. And it's kind of related to the second point, which is that, you know, place-based work, as we know, it's complex, it's nuanced, and it's very context-driven. So while there is a place for PDF files and downloading resources and case studies, you can't put this stuff in a manual. So there has to be enough opportunities for sort of third dimensional learning as well, which we think is really around, you know, the learning that happens with and through other people. And it's through reflective dialogue, it's through sharing of learning, and it's just being able to create that place and space and to do that, and also to have the resources and time to do it. And so in a way, in another analogy that seems to ring here is, I don't think anyone now disputes the absolute importance of investing in data, metrics, evaluation of outcomes in the work that we do. But I think it's now, and we think it's now, time to really get that same conviction investment into the necessity of learning and making that much more systematic in our work. And we did see some great examples of that in some of the places that we talked to. But I'm going to end there.
I think it's so interesting to think about, you know, the connection between identity and learning, right? The, you know, what the change makers, what kind of makes up their mindsets and the way that they operate and the things that they want to move forward. And are they like social entrepreneurs? And then what are the ways that are most effective for them to learn together?
Yes, absolutely. And the learning really helps define the identity and vice versa. So a lot of people shared with us, they're kind of learning by doing, but they wish that they could talk through with other colleagues and peers in other places what they're experiencing, so that they can put things in a greater sort of framework, so that it's easier for them to understand what they're doing, but also explain it to others as well. So absolutely, there is a huge connection there.
I quickly went over my first question, which I apologize to everybody who's listening, but I was going to ask each of you to just share a little bit about yourself and your connection to place-based research. So maybe what we can do is backtrack to that question for a second and learn a little bit more than your work, just a little snippet from each of you about how you connect into this work from a personal perspective. So Joe, why don't we start with you and then go to John and then end with Emily?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Delighted to be here, and it's really great to see how many people have joined. So my snippet, I'll try and make it a snippet, is I guess I had a very traditional career up until about the age 50, and then I pivoted basically into something that felt a bit more purpose driven. So my sort of more recent career journey has been, I retrained as a service designer at the age of 50. And in that, I guess that was my sort of rewiring of my brain, I suppose you'd say, from someone who'd been used to perhaps having a more corporate or business kind of perspective to learning to empathize, learning to read the literature around, how things change, working a lot around how you stitch together collaborations as opposed to more formalized partnerships. So it was that was my sort of key moment, I guess. And as part of that, I also started to work with a group of women looking to create a co-housing community. And that was the real mind-blowing moment where that was about sort of working in a participatory way, in a co-design participatory way with a group of people to create something using sort of cooperative methods. So somebody from a corporate background to sort of basically adopting the kind of thinking and methodology of cooperative communities was about as big a paradigm shift as I could make. And I'm sort of somewhere now in the middle of all that, I guess.
Great, thanks, Joe. John?
Hi, everybody. I'm just echoing Emily and Joe. Really delighted to be here, and thank you so much, Liz, for having us. So I think very different to Joe, I've spent almost all of my career at Renacy. I've been chief exec for 4 years, but I've been in the organisation for a lot longer than that. And Renacy isn't, I'll talk about it a bit more later on, but we're an odd organisation, and that oddness sometimes can make you feel de-skilled, because you don't neatly have a profession and a cohort in the way that if you were a social worker you would, or if you worked in housing you would, or if some of the other areas of work that many of our colleagues in other organisations have. But what all of our work throughout my time at Renacy has kind of been in between other people's work. And place has been the way in which I personally, but I think also Renacy organisationally, has kind of understood the connections and what our role is some of those sort of in-between roles, which can sometimes feel, as I say, kind of deprofessionalising almost, but can also give you a sense of purpose and meaning that cuts across so much of that and can be really quite sustaining. And it, I've been outside of work involved in things like credit unions and local approaches to thinking about change that try and cut across the sort of silos and bureaucracies that so often social change seems to get caught up in. I could talk at length, but that'll do for now, Liz.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. How about you, Emily?
So I suppose going back a little bit further, I grew up with my family moving to a different country about every 2 to 3 years, until I finally came to London in the UK and said I'm never going to move again. And I think that sort of constant moving perhaps was partly why I became jointly sort of professionally, but also my personal, I was really fascinated with how we learn and why we learn and change and adapt. Because obviously we had to do that a lot going from place to place, but we could also see just how different and in other ways very similar different cultures were. And I suppose the thing that really fascinates me is just the different types and levels of learning and change that we're capable of, from sort of knowledge and skills on one end of the spectrum that's a little bit more tangible, to differences in sort of attitudes, mindsets, ways of seeing the world on the other end of the spectrum. And I suppose the tie for me with place-based work is that place-based work, as we know, kind of involves both ends of the spectrum and everything in between. So it's kind of, and there's a huge amount of learning and change that's constantly involved.
So interesting to hear each of your stories, and it really ties back a little bit, Emily, to your answer to this first question, which is the connection between identity and learning, because each of you have a different entry point into place, but there are connections across those entry points, right? Whether it's, unlearning or learning a new way, as Joe talked about, or John, being in a place that is different from other places. And yeah, so interesting to think about, as you continue to do this research, how is that going to show up for the leaders that are engaged in place-based change? I think we'll move on to our next question, which is, the research also looked at international approaches to place-based change. And so what have you drawn from this international research, and what's unique about the UK context? And I think, Emily, you're going to start us off and answer this question.
Yeah, so I mean, we learned so many things from looking at sort of international practice, but also particularly looking at international learning centers. And I guess focusing on two of those things that really we found quite inspirational. One is that just the impact that a learning center can have around this type of work. Certainly, you know, Tamarack Institute in Canada, but also Collaborate for Impact in Australia and others that we spoke to in New Zealand and the US as well. But just the impact on multiple levels. So the first level of impact is clearly around empowering change makers through the ability to access learning, insight, new ideas, but also it's a very sort of dynamic platform where, you know, you're able to create the space for a community of change makers to come together, to build relationships and to get sort of the validation, the support, the inspiration that we all need to really continue in this work. And then the second level of impact that we saw that was really powerful was that over time, the ability of the learning centers with the communities involved to start influencing funders and policymakers, so that everyone can sort of enrich the understanding of place-based work, but also that sort of more systematic or systems levers can start to be pulled around policy change and around funding mechanisms, which is also incredibly important at sort of more regional and national levels. So that's one area of real inspiration that we got. The second area that we noticed in speaking with learning centers internationally is just that perhaps there's much more of a sort of direct willingness and also experience in addressing issues of racial injustice, you know, for reasons of history and demographics. And in the UK, although the awareness around racial inequality is growing, we found, speaking to the sort of places, that the language that we use are still a little bit more indirect. We talk about power dynamics, but we don't talk as much directly about race and injustices around that. And I think that there is a view that we need to do more in this space, absolutely, in this country as well. And I think there's a huge amount that we can learn from our colleagues and communities internationally.
Thanks so much, Emily. Really interesting. So Joe, this question is directed to you. So your research is proposing this Center for Place-Based Transformation and to be based in the UK. What are some of the key themes and what are some of the design features that have come through your research?
Yes, thanks, Liz. If I perhaps just start with just picking out some of the points of inspiration from the research then and how we responded to it. So I guess first, in no particular order, but firstly to say we sort of saw what we thought was quite an unhelpful fragmentation in this world of place-based change in the UK. Meaning that some of the projects, by no means all, because some of the projects were very well supported by their funders, but many projects really not finding ways of connecting with each other very well. But that's not to say that actually in the UK has got a very long and strong history actually of place-based working across many, many decades. But what we saw was programs stopping and starting, and the expertise and the know-how actually flittering away between those programs stopping, and not really having a place that treasured that know-how, captured it, and contained it really for other programs going forward. So I guess the first thing that we took from it is that we need a place that is not programmatic. It doesn't start and stop. It goes on and works across those programs. So that was one of our first conclusions. The second, and Emily's covered a little bit of this, but we saw that there is really the work around working in place is a very distinctive kind of skill. It requires a kind of set of disciplines which is not in the kind of normative management canon. It's really about, you know, sense making, wayfinding, influencing, convening, and sharing power. All of those things. But we found that kind of those skills and that way of working wasn't sort of given the right sort of honoured and recognised in the way that it could or should be, and that was sort of had some consequences. One, that people weren't confident about speaking about what they did, and you know, we felt very strongly there needed to be an honouring of that practice and a vernacular that goes with it that gave people confidence to talk about what they did and why they did it. and to be able to demonstrate that it's an effective way of working, even if the results are perhaps more opaque at the start. But it's a necessary process of working in this very different sort of way. But equally, what we didn't want to do, and we felt was not in the philosophy and approach of this way of working. This is not to sort of put around, try and codify this way of working, or overly straitjacket or over define it. It needs to be it needs to have to work in a very emergent way. So the sort of line we've been trying to tread, and this is what we've really learned from some of the international places, including Tamarack, that we've spoken to, is finding that sweet spot between giving people enough so they can navigate their own local journeys, but not overly codifying and straitjacketing that practice in a way that stops it evolving. The third point I'd say is that is the need to sell the story of impact and benefit more strongly. That's because I think we found, I think what we're looking at it in the UK as again, is reflecting this slightly patchy funding regime, is perhaps a lack of confidence that this is worth backing at scale. So we think part of what is needed is someone to pull together that story across the different projects and tell that story more powerfully. So if we could I'll tell you a little bit around how it's going to work, and I think I've got a couple of slides here just to help me sort of talk that through. So first of all, this is our model, and it's got 3 component elements, which I'll just briefly touch on. So starting with the sort of the orange bit, enable. This is really around us wanting to provide a sort of an engine, a learning engine that enables places to build their learning from each other through communities of practice, through a learning platform, a little like this one, where we can share knowledge and convene and get together with each other, and coaching and learning partners that help places learn from people that worked across different projects as a way of shortcutting some of that knowledge transfer. To inform about capturing that knowledge between and across projects, investing in the research and evaluation that demonstrates to policymakers and funders that this is something really worth backing, and creating that kind of collective evidence base, drawing and curating that global knowledge sources. And Liz, you all know there's a growing global community, and actually the culture of sharing knowledge across that community is a really important way of us collectively going forward, to the point that we then influence and use that knowledge and evidence, and this growing capability to influence those that hold the purse strings and hold the policy strings, and giving a voice to our sector. So that's, if you like, our overall and rather grand aspiration. And if we come on then to the question of how in the next slide, importantly, what we don't want to do is create a big institution that kind of tries to own the knowledge. This is about a collaboration, and that's important because there's a strong philosophical approach that goes with this way of working, which we want to, this our organizational, this needs to reflect. So this is based on the premise of a small central backbone, owned by a series or led by a series of core partners, which includes some of the organisations we referenced, Right to Succeed, who are a founding partner, to yourselves, Tamarack, Renesi, and the Government Outcomes Lab as some of those founding partners. Funders, importantly, as part of that core, and peer partners, those organisations that are leading the way in the UK in this form of practice. And then around it, basically convening a network of partners that will continue to own and lead their own work, but coming together, being convened through the centre and sharing their knowledge and know-how for the benefit of all. So really broadly, that's our model, and that's what we're looking to launch, hopefully, in the next few months.
It's a really interesting model. I know we've had many conversations with all of you at Tamarack about both the model and the design, and also, you know, the way that you envision how the work will unfold. John, you're one of the partners in this model. And so I thought we would learn first a little bit about Renesi, and then just talk a little bit about how you see your connection into this work.
Thanks, Liz. So as I said in my intro, Renesi is slightly odd. We're a social enterprise, so we're not a charity, although we are at the more charitable, not non-for-profit end of the social enterprise spectrum. And I know Canada has a similar sort of spectrum in the UK of different types of social enterprises. And we started back in 1998 as a spin out from a local authority to manage big chunks of government-led money, and investing in places, in neighbourhoods, and it was all about program management. And over the years, we have evolved and taken on new things and found new ways of working. But what the thread that has always run through our work is one of place. We haven't always used the language of place. And I think that sometimes in the UK, that language has come and gone in different ways. Particularly when we started, it was very much about neighbourhoods, and neighbourhood deprivation or deprived neighbourhoods was what was talked about a lot. But I think that is the sort of the thread that runs through our organisation. But along the way, we've done a variety of things that I sort of see as different ways in. So in your introduction about me, you mentioned the sort of the different things that we do. And that involves kind of working directly with individuals, so supporting economically excluded people in the communities that we know best, which is in London, a couple of parts of London particularly. So we work with refugees and migrants. We work with people who are long-term kind of out of the labour market for health reasons, and we try and support them back towards work or towards some kind of training or support or volunteering. And we feel that's really important for what we do, because we learn a lot about individual people and about how services work. We also have a consultancy arm where we work with organisations on organisational problems and on problems of measurement and impact and change, and they're kind of so that gives us a way into the organisational question, and we then do some of the same things that we do with organisations. We work with funders and foundations and help them think about how they spend their money and why, and what they value and what they want to invest in. And finally, we particularly in the last few years, we started to work kind of across places ourselves with a sort of facilitative role, trying to think about programs of social change across a place, trying to get out of organisational hierarchies and working across systems. And that, as I said at the start, is quite an odd organisation to do all of those things in one bucket. And on a bad day, it feels like, why have we got 3 organisations in one? But on a good day, it sparks the most interesting conversations and exchanges. And I can work on a consultancy project with leaders and mayors of local authorities alongside a refugee who's joined one of our programs. And it gives me a very different insight to the work that we're doing, because one of my team, who was a refugee that came through the program, lives in the place that we're working on, and she brings a completely different experience to our work that I just wouldn't have had if I just had a team of consultants alone. And some of those kind of cross-fertilization of ideas is really powerful to us. So I could talk at length about those, but that's kind of the strange business model that is Renaissing.
So you're a partner in this space, in this kind of collaborative space, this space of place-based transformation. What has drawn you into this work?
Yeah, so I'm going to use sort of a bit of a history to demonstrate that. And if you wouldn't mind jumping on to the next slide, this is a sort of timeline of when we of Renaissing. Sort of 97, 98, which was, for those of you that know UK, was the start of the new Labour government, through till past now, 2025. And in the past, we've talked to people about place-based change as a sort of a pendulum swinging back between conversations in policy circles about place, going then back to conversations about individuals, and then back to place again. And actually, the more I thought about it, the more it's kind of waves with currents bubbling under until they become bigger waves, and kind of, things don't completely go from the previous wave, just as new things are starting in the old one. And so we started at a time when there was this significant government-led intervention in places. It was all about the state, the role of the state. It was big chunks of money, very big chunks of money compared to where we are now in the UK in terms of state-led investment. But that, within a few years, actually, people were starting to question the efficacy of that. And there was a much kind of a growing interest in other themes around personalisation, the commissioning of services. And the UK went through a process of commissioning outsourcing a lot of work, starting to outsource a lot of work in that period. And we, as an organisation, were involved in that. We did some of the employment support work that we do has come from that. But what that meant was that, you know, the government was more and more interested in delivering a service to individuals than it was necessarily to thinking about whole places. Now, obviously, it's not an either or, but we saw this wave of focus on individuals, and that was kind of rising just before the financial crash of 2008-9, and in the UK, that was then followed by a coalition government coming in 2010. And at that time, there was, what that brought with it was huge questions of austerity. So massive de-investment, I suppose, through the public sector. But if you kind of combine austerity with the individual and commissioning world that was coming before, then you get lots of questions about value, about impact, about what's really working. And we saw in the UK a massive growth of things like what work centres and really understanding evidence-based policy and evidence-based interventions. And we at Renaissance followed that trend too, and a lot of our work has been about questions of evaluation and how we understand and value social change. And that really led to kind of conversations about scale and how do we scale up things that work. But any of us that have worked in places know that the scaling question is not always a neat one. And scaling suggests a level of kind of copying and pasting that we know that if you're working with the dynamics of communities, it feels like it's a different kind and quality of conversation. And so again, in the UK, we've seen in recent years a pushback to that around, you know, and much more interest in conversations around lived experience, around the importance of relationships, around the importance of collaboration, around the importance of different partners, different questions of ownership. And so you've got funders such as Power to Change, who I think are on this call, who are investing in, you know, community-led businesses, which is very, very different kind of question about place and what the role of money is in place that was happening at the start of my timeline here, which was much more about the role of the state. And so I think the whole policy agenda in the UK has, as Emily said earlier, and Joe said earlier, there's a very long history in the UK of questions of place and investing in place. But in the last 20 years, I think it's moved away from the state more towards a variety of partners. And Renaissance has been on that journey. And I think where we are now is this kind of place again, but what's it going to look like? And I think there's, you know, I'm really excited and very positive about these system-wide collaborative approaches and trying to use the language of place to think very differently about how we deliver social change and how we work across bureaucracies and across systems, but at the same time also with communities, thinking about relationships, and rather than it just being services done too. And I think there's a lot of potential, and so that kind of history, it's my history of the UK policy, but it's kind of Renaissance's history as well, because it reflects the kind of work that we've been doing. And that's what's drawn us to this. And I remember there's a quote in the report that we wrote about the research that we did, and it came from a number of places, but the Galileo play from Brecht, where there's a line in it around, you know, pity the land that has no heroes, and it's pity the land that is in need of heroes. And too often in the past, we've kind of hoped that place-based change would happen if you find the right hero to lead it, and it would all, isn't it wonderful? And we kind of glorify these individuals and these small organizations. Actually, what we need is to find ways to learn from each other, ramp up the identity, and think about collaboration much more, so that we don't need a hero to do it, that we're actually working in this collaborative way more naturally. I'll stop there.
I love the visual that this slide brings forward, and you know, the way that you talk about it in terms of these waves of change, you know, and what the, you know, what the wave of change going into 2025 might look like, both in the UK, and it kind of makes me reflect on, you know, what do the waves of change look like in Canada, and how have we found ourselves, you know, either bobbing on top of the waves or sometimes being drawn into, you know, the rip of the wave, right? Because sometimes we are on the top and sometimes we're at the rip of the wave.
Absolutely.
So for those of you that are on the call, if you have a question for Emily, for John, or for Joe, please put it into the question and answer box. I have one more question for you three. and then we'll get to the questions from the folks that are listening into the call. And so my final question is really a bit of a reflection question, which is, why do you think that this work is so pivotal to communities? And what can we, what do you think the roles of stakeholders should be in this work?
I'm happy to kick off with that. I mean, I think it kind of follows on nicely with what John just shared, and the fact that there's already been sort of an evolution towards collaboration, multi-stakeholder work. But I think the other thing is, though, that in the past year, the world has kind of changed in fundamental ways with the sort of combination of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. It's almost brought an intensity to what people and communities are their sense of sort of urgency and agency around change. And, you know, it's brought out, as we know, a lot more sort of uncomfortable truths about inequality. But at the same time, there's also a kind of optimism that, you know, things that long-standing attitudes and systems can start to shift if there's enough momentum and enough people out there at all levels who want it to shift. And I think that actually, I guess Graham from Right to Succeed said, you know, there's no other way of doing the kind of work except for, you know, bringing about local change we were talking about, besides place-based work. We can't, you know, in this day and age, we can't imagine trying to bring about local transformation without collaborative working, without the community at the center. And I just hope that, you know, just like today, nobody really questions the value of teamwork, that in a few years' time, nobody will question the value of place-based collaborative working to bring about interesting changes at the local level.
Joe, what about you? What would your response be?
Well, I suppose I'm picking up from the second part of that question. I mean, on our sort of wish list, I think would be, first of all, a long-term and patient policy and funding support from government and indeed other funders. This is fundamentally, we're in this environment, I think, where we know that this sort of change is highly complex, highly uncertain. It needs patience and time and belief, and we need the funding and policy patterns to follow that. So I think that's the if you like, that's the role, that's the ask of some of the key stakeholders, and a relationship which is less around, you know, we asked, did you do, and more about sort of an accountable dialogue, you know, around people sort of leaning in to understanding the problem in more depth together in learning, and using learning as a foundation to both commission and fund better, as well as to deliver better. So a different kind of more equal relationship and a more immersive relationship, if you like. I think there is, you know, the nature of the partnership between local organisations. I think in our own sort of thinking around, well, what is place-based change? We see it as a collaboration between those that currently hold power and responsibility and communities. It's not an or, so it's how you stitch together those relationships in a very inclusive way. And I think that what that means in terms of roles is that certainly local government organisations, local actors giving up power and sharing power, having a different form of, adopting a different form of leadership in working with local organisations. And then I think just finally, there's also something around, and this is a selfish ask for the, I guess, we're linked to the vision of the centre, is that for funders to collaborate more by not setting it, by using a common infrastructure. And I guess that's the vision for our organisation, is to be that common infrastructure. And if it's not us, then a common infrastructure somewhere that means that we have some sort of platform for sharing and learning together. And I think for the UK, which has not done that, and I think looking internationally where it has been done, I think what we really see is that's a real essential for the UK to move its practice forward.
John, any thoughts to add?
Yeah, I'll be quick because I'm conscious of time, but I think just to kind of bring it back to a couple of points that were made earlier around what we're trying to achieve with the proposed centre is the language is so important to those who are doing this work. And I think that language can't, you know, also to my point about heroes, that language and that kind of definition of this practice being important. Can't just sit with places. It has to be understood and owned by central government, by regional and local government, by different funders, because otherwise you're kind of fighting against the tide of a system that's talking a different language and working in a different way and not understanding value in the same way. And so, I think it can be so transformative for all the reasons that have been talked about, but it has to happen from other parties as well as the places, because my experience is that often communities and places that we work with, they understand this way of working instinctively because it makes sense to their community. But people who see and act like a state, it doesn't always make sense to them, and often they need to change a bit more. And so, for me, it's the role that other stakeholders should take is to also go with the shift of language and shift of understanding that we think is so important.
Hey, we're coming to the end of our time. I want to thank Emily, John, and Joe for joining us today, and thank all of you for engaging with us in this learning session. It was really great to hear about the Center for Place-Based Transformation, but more importantly, the research that has gone on through your work, both at Renaissance and at Project Place, and really trying to understand what a Center for Place-Based the kind of capacity and the focus of a Center for Place-Based Transformation, and how it might transform, work in the UK. And I think by virtue of the connections that you've made internationally, work in many other countries. So really excited about that and really excited about the next steps.